Greetings, and welcome to my presentation on how to analyze and improve your pipelines. My name is Elizabeth Blythe, and I'm the Studio Development Director at FireMonkeys here in Melbourne. Part of my role is owning and improving the processes that we use at FireMonkeys to deliver great games. As we get started, I want to spare a moment to thank our studio's video expert, Alex Venville, who helped me put this video together. Hopefully the contents of this presentation are what you're expecting. The first thing we will do is have a quick look at an example pipeline that we use to deliver content to a live service game, The Sims FreePlay. We won't go over it in depth, but I'll use it for illustrative purposes to show you what the various parts of a pipeline look like. The next thing we will do is create our own pipeline using a family dinner example. Once we have done that, we'll talk about how to analyze your pipeline to determine if it's working well, and if it is not, some key things that you can do to improve your pipeline's performance. Pipelines tend to emerge organically. Often, in a small team, everyone can easily tell who is doing what, and drawing your pipeline might not be necessary. However, sometimes it pays to stop and think about what you're doing and how you're doing it. Further, if you're in a large team or a team of teams, then pipeline mapping may be wholly necessary to gain control and insight into the way you are approaching delivery. Regardless, the only way to concretely know that you understand your pipeline is to map it, and I promise you that even in small teams, what you learn may surprise you. There are a lot of benefits to mapping. First, it creates clarity for the entire team. Second, it shows everyone key dependencies, calls them out, and gives you the opportunity to manage them. Third, done right, it creates a system of accountability for who is responsible for what. Finally, mapping your pipeline can identify points of failure and risky processes. Anyone can create a pipeline. You can even do it with a pencil and paper. However, common programs for mapping include Miro, Microsoft Visio, and Google Shapes. Common shapes used to map a pipeline are flowchart shapes and business process model notation, called BPMN. BPMN is the ISO standard for process mapping, but you can do pretty much whatever you want. Use the colors you prefer, choose shapes that evoke the correct connotation. Your aim is to be legible. Process mapping is an art form. You are not trying to document every little detail. Rather, you want to aim for two things. First, a consistent level of granularity across the pipeline. And second, a pipeline that other people can follow. It's more important that the team can read it and it's providing them value than that you document every possible nuance. This is an example of a real end-to-end pipeline as we use to deliver content for our live service game, Sims FreePlay. As you can see, we have broken our pipeline into 5 phases: content planning, art briefs, asset creation, implementation, and polish. We've also described how long it takes us to get through each phase. As we move through our pipeline, starting with the producer who acts as a coordinating function, we use these stars to indicate when we have achieved a milestone. We also use these alert symbols in order to let the producer know when they should be communicating to someone specific within the team. Because we know our timings and we can then therefore forward plan all of these milestones, we have the ability in order to create focus for the team so that they are always preparing for the next milestone. This helps ensure our operating rhythm. Things to keep in mind as we work. First, you get the information required to draw a pipeline by interviewing key participants in the process. Start by setting up meetings with key people, usually in the general order of pipeline flow. You should interview at least one person from each swim lane in the general order that the work is done. I typically start with the producer because as a coordinating function, they can probably give me an initial high-level end-to-end process. From there, I'll refine the pipeline as I meet a person from each discipline. You will go through several drafts and iterations because just writing down what you do generally isn't good enough. Most people want to write it down, then improve upon it. While you're drafting up your pipeline, ask other questions. For example, ask people how long it typically takes to move an item on average through their part of the pipeline. You can also ask where things tend to go wrong and what types of things can be done at the outset to prevent those issues. I will frequently ask if there's anything they need before they can get started and how they ensure quality. I'm looking for things like review or validation tasks that can make a pipeline robust. But you can ask anything you'd like to know. I often use annotations to add context to the pipeline or to remind people of important information that's otherwise hard to show. All right, let's attempt to create a pipeline of our own. Maybe we can use a typical chicken dinner. Let's start with this parent doing a meal plan. So they'll plan the meal. Once the process is started, maybe they will go shopping to get the food that they need. After they've gone shopping, they'll come back with the chicken, which this parent might dress. So we'll have them dress the chicken. Once they've dressed the chicken, they might put it into the oven. Now that the chicken's in the oven, maybe we'll get the eldest child involved. And they might chop some vegetables. And once their vegetables are chopped, maybe they will grate the sauce. And steam the vegetables. It's a very active child. While we're waiting for this chicken to complete cooking, we'll put a little timer on there. Maybe the chicken will then complete. So we'll have timer buzzes. And then at that point in time, maybe we can get that youngest involved to plate up. And then maybe they will finalize the meal by serving up. Now that we've laid out the tasks in the swim lanes that people will do the work, we can now start to connect them. Notice that by creating these lines, I'm saying what is dependent on what. So even though I might start chopping the vegetables after the chicken is done, I actually only need to go shopping before I can start chopping the vegetables. In general, I have moved items that are not happening in time into some sort of parallelization so that way I can kind of see when things are going to happen. I'm not going to plate up until these vegetables are steamed, but I'm also probably going to wait for that chicken to come out of the oven. And there we have it, a very simple pipeline where you can see that there are different responsibilities between different people and there's some sort of parallelization going and so on. Now, this is a simple example. There's a lot of subtleties that you can use, and you can use a lot of different icons and other images, different colors, in order to get your point across. What you're trying to do is be legible to the person who's reading it. While this pipeline is simplistic, there are some common rules to follow. I use the term rules loosely. Remember, the goal is legibility, but some consistency is key to that. Give your pipeline a title. It usually goes in the upper left-hand corner. Divide the map into swim lanes based on which group is doing the work. Generally, start tasks with a verb. For example, write narrative, unwrap UV maps, etc. Lay tasks out sequentially, left to right, top to bottom. If your connector is going backwards, it should signal rework. Try not to cross lines for neatness sake. If you can't adjust the map so that lines don't cross, you can use a circle with an arrow and a label to jump to another circle with an arrow and the same label another place on the map. Try to display parallel tasks where possible. You can indicate time with a bar. Mark key dependencies with a red line. If you want to put a decision into your map, that's the diamond shape above, make sure you have connectors coming out of the shape that represent each potential decision. You can use vertical lines to break up the pipeline up into phases. Please beware of a common tendency to design maps that reflect a perfect reality that is not what is actually happening in your business. If drawing your pipeline indicates that something needs to change, you need to communicate and agree with the people within a swim lane that they will do what the process map says rather than bear false witness. You cannot analyze or optimize a process map that fundamentally isn't true. I hope this summary shows you how easy it is to map your pipeline and gives you confidence to try it yourself. How do you know if your pipeline is experiencing inefficiencies? The purpose of creating a repeatable process is to provide reliable results. If you follow it, you should get near the same output every time. If that's not the case, think about what you're doing and look for some of these common problems. First, do you have coordinating functions or alignment functions in your pipeline? Second, do you have feedback loops and control functions that allow you to monitor progress at key points? Make sure that you have identified and managed any bottlenecks in your pipeline. Ensure that you have entry and exit criteria or standards when team members are passing work from one swim lane to another. Make sure the right people are owning the right things to ensure a model of accountability. Also, think about whether the people who are responsible to deliver work have a high level of autonomy in the way they deliver. Think about redundancy, the elimination of waste, and why people are doing what they do. Note, most problems in a pipeline won't be occurring within a single swim lane, but rather where swim lanes cross and coordination between people is required. For every line that you have that crosses a swim lane, think about whether that pass is well handled and if the receiving party has everything they need. Once you know what's wrong with your pipeline, you can start putting solutions in place to resolve those weaknesses. Our first key concept is don't over-engineer. This is when you attempt to make your pipeline so robust that you weigh people down with process. You may have more features in your pipeline than is necessary for its intended use, or it may be unnecessarily complex or inefficient for what you're trying to gain. If you're designing a pipeline from scratch, that's great. But most of us are already in an existing workplace and need to figure out how to make something better without breaking everything. Research-backed business efficiency methodologies like Six Sigma say that 80% of your problems can be solved by pulling only 20% of your levers. If you have a pipeline that's already in flight, which most of us do, then it's highly valuable to observe where your highest priority fixes in the pipeline ought to be. If you do a lot of radical changes at once, you could confuse people and increase your risk of failure. So use common sense about which changes are feasible in a way that people will understand. And if you're doing a deep, radical process reengineering activity, this is not done in an hour or even a week. Expect to spend some time iterating on your pipelines, thinking about the changes, consulting with people, and planning a rollout. It's also important to keep in mind that while some pipelines may seem particularly efficient on paper, they may not be a natural way to work. If it looks good but feels wrong, you may have over-engineered the process. The best way to avoid this is to ask people if the process feels unwieldy and how they would suggest you improve it. You might not need to do a big overhaul, nor should you if things are basically working and could just do with a little bit of efficiency. You can still make a lot of progress and huge improvements by focusing on the right things, and you'd be surprised at how much efficiency you can gain just by introducing clarity about who's doing what by mapping the pipeline. However, to ensure you've achieved the right level of process engineering, ask these things at the end. Is what we decided to do actionable? Is it sustainable? Will people understand the reasoning behind the changes and support them? Will they willingly adhere to the new pipeline? If the answer is yes, congratulations, you've improved your pipeline. If the answer is no, then check your priorities to see whether you're targeting the places that will give you the best value in return for your effort. Our second key concept is to find the bottleneck. All processes have at least one bottleneck. Some processes have more. Generally, a bottleneck is a point where things get stuck in a queue and can't move forward in the pipeline while the rest of the pipeline becomes idle waiting on the queue. If you eliminate a bottleneck, another bottleneck will always arise. In a perfectly efficient pipeline, where no queues are being produced, the bottleneck is simply the task that takes the most time. There are huge mathematical ways to figure out what your bottleneck is, but most of us familiar with the process can identify a bottleneck by gut feel. If you're interested in the math behind identifying a bottleneck, look up Little's Law. Or you can shortcut it, like a lot of Kanban teams do. Just ask the representative of each swim lane, how many items can you comfortably have in your queue at once? Then, you place a constraint on each swim lane regarding how many items they can put forward. This creates constraints between your swim lanes that prevent the bottleneck from being overburdened. There are multiple ways to improve a bottleneck, although not all treatments will eliminate it. You can reduce the bottleneck by making it more efficient, remove the bottleneck, or reorganize the work around the bottleneck. Closely monitor the bottleneck. Invest in resources at the point of the bottleneck. Or create a buffer of work built up within the bottleneck so the next person in the pipeline always has something to pick up. It's important to note that you can achieve better results with multiple of these treatments than by merely choosing just one. For example, on my very first game project when I was the producer, I identified a project bottleneck during scheduling. Laying the timeline out, I noticed that our animator could only produce 1 to 3 animations per day, and our game required well over 130 animations to be produced in 3 months. After the animations were complete, we still needed time to implement them. I explained the situation to the team, and we immediately stopped work on any part of the pipeline that did not involve enabling animation. First, we spent a whole sprint with the single goal of unblocking animation. This allowed animation to begin work earlier than the pipeline dependencies would normally allow. Next, we listed all of the required animations and prioritized which ones were high impact and therefore high priority to become bespoke animations, and which ones we could consolidate down to reusable, looped animations with a mood. Finally, we monitored our animation progress closely to determine if we were on target or if we needed to make any further adjustments, such as cutting scope. Without addressing that bottleneck, we would have delivered that project more than a month later than we did. It's hard to understate the importance of identifying and managing your bottlenecks. So to that end, I recommend investigating the Agile theory of constraints. They use a 5-step process to manage a bottleneck based on the older theory of constraints by the manufacturing industry. It's fascinating to read, and it contains a powerful systemic approach to improve your pipeline when you've identified a bottleneck. At a high level, the recommendation is, first, identify your constraints. That's another word for bottleneck. Second, exploit the constraint. This involves making sure that you get the most business value you possibly can out of the bottleneck. You may do things like ensure the backlog of items going into the bottleneck is both clear and highly prioritized towards return on investment. This makes sure the bottleneck is always working on the highest business value items. Third, subordinate everything to the constraint. The bottleneck should never have to wait for a specialist's assistance. Everything they need should be on hand, and incoming work should be quality checked before it reaches the constraint. The clear backlog, a clear entry and exit criteria, and so on. It can even mean subordinating management's desires if sufficient key controls are in place. Ultimately, this is about shaping the pipeline outside of the constraint swim lane to strategically support the bottleneck. Fourth, elevate the constraint. This is about making the constraint more efficient, provide training, improve on tools and automation, procure faster workstations, and basically do anything you can to reduce the time and effort of getting items through the pipeline at the point of the bottleneck. You eliminate time wasted inside the constraint and ensure the bottleneck doesn't waste time doing things other parts of the pipeline can do. With the practice of drum buffer rope, a manufacturing reference, the bottleneck can even signal when it is ready to take on more work. Fifth and finally, don't let inertia cause a constraint. This is about periodically reviewing your pipeline. Don't get so comfortable doing things the way they've always been done that you essentially create a bottleneck simply by complacency. Ultimately, when dealing with the bottleneck, the goal is to change your pipeline from a push system, where you try to stuff all of the meaty ideas you have into the front of a sausage maker and gum it all up, to a pull system, where the bottleneck signals to the rest of the pipeline when it's ready to make more sausage. Our next concept is key controls. The purpose of establishing key controls is to reduce process variation and thereby mitigate risk. A key control is essentially a building block of a feedback loop that tells you if your pipeline is working within the expected tolerance of behavior. For example, let's take a chicken dinner. It does no good to open the oven and see the chicken is burned. We don't want to wait for the results of a process to see that it failed. Rather, we create key controls to monitor the process. In a chicken dinner, our key controls are temperature and time. Your feedback loop might be the red light that lets you know the oven is to temperature and the buzzer going off. This ensures your meal comes out perfect. So how do you make sure you have an effective key control? Well, a key control must have three aspects. The first is that any control you have can be tested in a binary way to see if it has been achieved. For example, are all activities in your pre-production checklist complete before you officially move into production? The second is that you have standards in place. This is what you measure against as your tolerance. For example, you may want to have someone check and confirm your team's sprint work meets the definition of done. Or do you just trust that all required test automation was written for newly implemented code? Finally, you need to have some feedback loops, something that alerts you when a tolerance is breached. It could be an SMS that alerts you when a server goes down, or it could be feedback entered into a register when someone's reviewing your game feature. Whatever you do, it's probably better to have feedback loops that can be designed so you naturally pay attention to them. For example, you'll pay far more attention if you only get an SMS alert about a server shutting down than you will if you're bombarded with SMS every time you do a build. So to reiterate, first, you determine what parts of your pipeline require key controls. Then, what standards you expect for the control. And finally, you establish what alerts you'll use to communicate the state of your pipeline. In a pipeline, key controls are extremely important. They can be audited for effectiveness. In some industries, key controls are even regulated. For example, we limit the amount of lead allowed in paint, then test paint frequently during production. Key controls also expose potential areas of pipeline failure to systemic scrutiny. Examples in a business context could be setting tolerance around project delivery KPIs, like earned value, schedule variance, or scope. A manager approving someone's work to provide quality control. A definition of done that you can check your work against. Project milestones with a standardized review, like the aforementioned pre-pro checklist. Whatever you do, it's important that if the standards around a key control are breached, that action is taken. The whole point of a key control is to let you know when you need to do something to ensure the outcome, like turn down the temperature of the oven, or determine if you need to cut a feature from scope or renegotiate your schedule. Our next key concept is communication patterns. Imagine every dot on these topology maps is a person working in a system with another person or other people. Obviously, some of these topologies are more efficient at communicating. A subtle inefficiency in processes is the time lost in people running back and forth trying to talk to each other to get whatever it is they need, including checking in just to make sure they understand the big picture. There's a lot of science behind this, but the takeaway message is to think about how everyone in the process knows that it's A, time for them to do something, or B, where in the pipeline the entire process is at. If your pipeline is long, create points of realignment across the whole map for visibility. It may be an announcement to everyone that says, hey, we've achieved scope lock, or another milestone. Look for communication points to align people so that each node doesn't have to run around trying to gather info, resources, etc. from other nodes to gain process efficiency. Generally, some great places to align communication are at the end of delivery phases. An alert to stakeholders to let them know that you're leaving pre-pro and are moving into prod, or that you've completed prod and are now in first pass testing. In fact, you can align around any milestone, and milestones are great places for key controls as well. As control points are great, you can change a push system to a pull system by pre-scheduling alignment points to form caps into the schedule. For example, if I know that it takes about 3 weeks to deliver 3D assets, I can schedule an asset review meeting in 3 weeks. Then, Everyone knows their focus is going to be to get assets complete for the review meeting in 3 weeks' time, which can be a milestone and a key control in my pipeline. This forward activity creates bookends that control a section of my pipeline. It also gives you highly visible awareness when, for example, someone comes and says they're not able to be ready for that meeting. Not only do you know that the pipeline isn't being adhered to, you can quantify by how much and if it's still in delivery tolerance. If you're continuously missing this milestone, you may come to realize you need 4 weeks and adjust your pipeline or put other treatments into place. Our next key concept is to eliminate waste. Let's assume at this stage that you have a pipeline mapped and you've gone through the other concepts. It's time to review your pipeline and think about, why are these steps necessary? Are there any steps that can just be deleted? Is there anything we do a lot of that requires relatively little skill? Can those steps be automated? Are there any steps that can be combined? If I'm concerned about the duration, are there any steps that we can move in parallel of one another? When you do this, beware of introducing new bottlenecks. Where does it make sense to implement key controls that I can monitor to know my process is working? Are there milestones I can reschedule to manage time or signal the state of the process to team members? Where do I need to align or realign communication? Do I need a coordinating function? Where should we implement production cells? Do the correct people own the correct tasks? i.e., is there alignment between what I expect a swim lane to produce and who is making decisions about that work? Pro tip, don't do this alone in your office. Bring a group of people together to discuss how you might make changes to your pipeline using these concepts. In the last slide, I briefly touched upon whether or not the right people are doing the right work. Part of what you're doing when you build a pipeline like this is creating a system of accountability. A rule of thumb is that any task that sits within a given swim lane is the responsibility of that swim lane. Generally, the members of the swim lane should have a sense of high autonomy over that work. So ask yourself, does your pipeline ensure that the correct people own the correct tasks? i.e., the team has the required skill, clarity, confidence, and motivation to do the work. If a task sits within a swim lane, does that team in question have room and responsibility to achieve the results for their work? Do they have the ability to define the standard required of incoming work? Do they have the autonomy to refuse incoming work? Are there mechanisms that check the quality of outgoing work? This is often a good control point. And in a way, this is the most important key concept of all, agreement. What you have done so far has been a draft for so long. You went over it with multiple people several times, but it's not your pipeline until everyone agrees to it. At this point in time, I'd normally take questions. I'll pop by the EA booth to answer some questions live, so please stop in. In the meantime, probably the most common and biggest question I get about mapping pipelines is along the lines of, this is great, but doesn't my pipeline look very waterfall? How does this fit in with Agile? Alas, there's no secret to it. A pipeline is not necessarily waterfall. Waterfall and Agile don't need to greatly differ in how we produce the work. They differ in the time frame by which you move through the pipeline. Waterfall will often move through the work over an extended period. Agile generally chunks deliverables down to move work through the pipeline in smaller bites so that they go through the whole process in a single sprint. If you're using Agile, you're still going to need to design something before you code it, before you test it. There are a lot of highly useful subtleties in Agile frameworks beyond the pipeline itself, like how you prioritize, slice, and group work to create value. Unfortunately, that's not the focus of this presentation, so maybe that will be a topic for another GCAP. Another question I've gotten is, how do I tell if my delivery problems are a pipeline issue or a personality conflict? And what do I do in either case? I start by asking myself, if I can replace this operator with someone else, will the same problem or a very similar problem present itself? If yes, it's a pipeline issue. In this case, I work with the operator to try to understand how to approach the solution, as they themselves are the subject matter experts and best positioned to find the solution to the problem. However, if the answer is no, and it is a behavioral or personality problem, my first step would be to attempt to coach the person in adhering to the pipeline. If that doesn't work, I'd seek to supplement the operator with another one, or, in the absolute worst cases, potentially seek an alternative operator. If you found this presentation interesting, or are working on something where you require a deeper understanding of these topics, here are some of the concepts that you can look up to learn more, as well as some of the references that I found useful in bringing this presentation together. Finally, I want to say thank you for your interest in this presentation. If you'd like to get in touch, please feel free to contact me via social media. I hope you have a pleasant day and enjoy the rest of your GCAP.